During the early and mid 1990s, American gamers engaged in an all-out civil war known as the 16-bit console wars. During this time, gamers rallied behind either the Sega Genesis or the Super Nintendo and fought to the death. Well, actually not too much. Many gamers like myself owned both, and most gamers, truth be told, could see quite a bit of value in the other system, even if they didn't happen to own it. But despite the fact that it was a hard-fought battle and that both sides clearly had a lot going for them, many Nintendo fans have since declared victory and said that it was actually not a contest and that Nintendo won both in terms of being a better system qualitatively and in terms of sales, and they claim that Nintendo blew out Sega. Well, the problem is that victors are entitled to write the history, but you have to actually win to do that. And Nintendo did not gain a clear victory in the console war. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delineate and dismantle what I call the Nintendo narrative that has been promoted by all of the Nintendo kids who grew up and became internet celebrities and then promoted this line that Nintendo was the clear runaway winner of the console war, because that simply isn't the case, as we're going to discover. My interest in the 16-bit era really re-emerged about 10 years ago, and I really started to get back into that era of gaming, and I started to look for a lot of games that I'd missed out on back in the day. And one thing that I noticed immediately is that the discourse about retro gaming was massively dominated by Nintendo fans. Every time that I would see a reference to Sega, if it was a positive reference at all, it would only reference Streets of Rage and Sonic, as if those were the only two decent games on the whole platform. And I noticed that everyone there was a hardcore Nintendonian. Many of them had only stuck with Nintendo for the NES and SNES and then gone to PC. Others of them were still loyalist. And it was just an extraordinary degree of bias that I was not expecting to find. So, over the years, I've looked at these posts, and here is sort of a composite portrait of what I call the Nintendo narrative. This is sort of my imagining of what the average Super Nintendo supremacist would say if they had to try to articulate why the SNES was the better console. They would tell you that it's more powerful, has a better controller, always had better graphics, always had better sound, and that when games were released on both consoles, the better version was always the Super Nintendo version. They would also tell you that the first-party games on Nintendo were simply superior to the first-party games on Sega. And then they would tell you, with more than a little bit of smugness, that this superiority is obvious due to the enduring legacy of SNES games and franchises. Well, like all narratives, there's always some kernel of truth to what is being said, but there is also a lot of crap here, and I'm going to completely dismantle the Nintendo narrative over the rest of this video. Like any narrative that doesn't have a strong factual basis, the Nintendo narrative is full of omissions, oversights, and errors. Let's look at some of the bigger ones, some of the general ones, before we then go into more detail. So first of all, a lot of people who promote the Nintendo narrative seem to have absolutely no appreciation for how hard it is to crack into the US market in 1989. Nintendo had a virtual monopoly. The NES had completely and totally dominated the third console generation. And worse than that, Nintendo was trying to make moves to set up a monopoly, and not a virtual one, a real one. And their way of doing that was by using their licensing system and the threat of not granting permission to license games in order to keep third-party developers loyal to Nintendo, a practice which either is or should be illegal. At any rate, though, what this meant is that third-party developers were reluctant to work with Sega, and they had to really walk on eggshells and do things where they wouldn't violate the agreements that Nintendo forced them into. So this meant that Sega was operating at a disadvantage since many of the premier developers in the gaming industry were not releasing games on the Genesis platform until a fairly late date. You'll notice that Genesis was late to the party with things like Castlevania and Contra and a lot of games from Capcom. And that's no coincidence. That's exactly how Nintendo wanted it to be. So Genesis basically had to succeed without the support of a whole lot of major developers and was only able to secure their support later on. So that means that Sega, whatever else it may have succeeded or failed at, did succeed in breaking a monopoly which would have most likely crippled the gaming industry had it stood. Another major issue that I have with the Nintendo narrative is that a lot of Nintendo fans really try to include the 16-bit war, which is a single war, into the larger conflict between Nintendo and Sega. And they think that the failure of the Saturn and Dreamcast and ultimate demise of the company as a hardware manufacturer is relevant to the period of the 16-bit wars. But it really isn't. You can win a war at one time and then lose another one without having lost the first one. Losing later does not change what happened in the past. Again, narratives sometimes don't require logic, but I'm going to enforce logic here, especially since so many Nintendo people like to talk about facts, logic, and numbers. I think that it's important to be consistent. You can't claim that events later on changed the reality of events earlier. It just doesn't work that way. The thing that pisses me off more than anything else in the world is when someone substitutes a talking point for an argument, and then they think that they're making a profound observation about the world, when in fact all they're doing is making an uncritical claim that they couldn't possibly back up if their life depended upon it. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I was in college, I was approached by a bunch of libertarians who were trying to spread the gospel of Ron Paul, and they would tell me that government was ineffective because in 1877, the government was not able to prevent the spread of railroad ash from the newly established railroads. Well, it's not the 1870s anymore. Our ability to protect the environment and regulate this newfangled rail system has improved. Or, in the 2016 cycle, John Oliver ran a hit piece against Jill Stein, calling her an anti-vaxxer, and most of my friends, who were all highly educated people who should know better, still believe it. And they really don't understand that this was a mere smear, and that if you actually look into what Jill Stein has said about vaccines, that there's no truth to this narrative at all. So, at any rate, this is something that is the bane of my existence, and it no doubt will continue to be, but I'm going to take a stand here, and really put a lot of trust in Nintendo fanboys to listen. So, let's talk about the talking points for Nintendo people. One thing that was started by AVGN James Roth was comparing SNES and 32X Doom just based on the music without really considering the game. And yeah, if you listen to the music sample, the SNES music is pretty close to CD quality, and the 32X has a farty quality to it. The problem is that doesn't consider how the game actually plays. While the 32X version only has 15 levels, those levels are playable. Yeah, it's a short game and it wasn't completed, but it's playable. That's more than I can say for the SNES version. It sounds great, but the draw distance is awful, and the controls are sticky. You get stuck on the walls all the time. The game is pretty close to unplayable. Also, I hear the argument that the SNES is better because of the sales figures for units. I guess this is a repeat of that old argument, the market is never wrong or something. I couldn't possibly disagree more, but I'm going to go into the actual sales figures to show you that it's not quite what you think. Also, I've heard that the SNES is better just based on the strength of its JRPG lineup. And that's an argument, but it is limited. That's merely one genre among many, and I think that we have to avoid letting hindsight really overpower what people experienced at the time. I also have heard the argument that the SNES is better because its bestsellers sold more than the bestsellers for the Genesis. Well, one, if the SNES did in fact sell more consoles, that would make sense. And two, once again, it's an argument from popularity, and it's not really terribly relevant to which system was better from an experiential standpoint. I've also heard, and this is sort of a subplot, but that Donkey Kong Country selling like crazy killed the Sega Genesis. No, it didn't. There were a lot of factors that have ultimately killed the Genesis, but DKC wasn't one of them. Even if DKC hadn't been released or hadn't been a big hit, that really wouldn't have changed all that much. And I also find it weird that the argument often boils down to numbers, like the number of colors the SNES can produce, or the number of units that it sold, or whatever, because that's kind of ironic in lieu of what has happened since, where Nintendo has consistently put out underpowered and completely non-innovative systems that have been markedly inferior to their competition. So why was it that technical superiority made the SNES the clear choice, but then technical inferiority wasn't a problem later? Doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, you have to admit. And now, ladies and gentlemen, time for the least interesting argument in the Nintendo narrative, the idea that the market decided that the SNES was inherently superior to the Genesis, and that we should abide by the wisdom of people who spent money and went into credit card debt in good 90s fashion. Alright, so here's one major problem right out of the gate. If you look on Wikipedia right now, you'll notice that the official Nintendo narrative number is 49 to 29 million units sold. But then if you were to say go over to the Genesis page and look at the numbers, you'll notice something interesting. And that is that Sega licensed other companies to build models of the Genesis during the late 90s. Some of these models were sold in countries where Sega couldn't market directly, i.e. in Brazil, Tectoy does all the marketing for systems. In Korea, I believe it was it Sanyo or Samsung or I don't know who. At any rate, though, there were 10 million more units sold that the Nintendo narrative doesn't account for. And when we're talking about millions of consoles moved, that's kind of important. If we're looking at this as a matter of numbers, then getting the number right kind of matters. And 2 or 3 million of that number also came from a licensed Sega Genesis system here in the United States, the Genesis 3, which was built by a third party. And this was actually a pretty quality build, despite the fact that it looks cheap. I actually own one. It's pretty good. So the numbers in the official Nintendo narrative are off by 10 million, which is a pretty damn big accounting error. And the reason why Nintendo won is solely due to their dominance in Japan. In every other market, Genesis won by a hair. If you look at Japan, Sega only moved 4.3 million units. Nintendo moved about 17.7 million. So that was not close. In Europe and other more minor markets, Sega outperformed Nintendo 10.4 to 8.6 million units. In North America, Sega moved 25 million units, Nintendo moved about 23.4. So here in the US, Sega won. So apparently, American gamers in the American market thought that the Genesis was superior if we actually believed this idiotic idea that people with credit cards have the wisdom of Confucius. By comparison, though, the NES must be superior to both of them, because the NES globally sold 61.9 million units and 34 million in the US. So if you're looking at it just by sales, you have to admit that the SNES underperformed its predecessor. more people bought and played the NES than they did the SNES. So if we're really going to push this argument, then you have to acknowledge that Nintendo dropped the ball with the SNES since it did not succeed to the same extent as its predecessor, either globally or in the United States. But since the enduring console war debate is primarily an American one, let's focus in on sales figures in America. After all, another weirdness of the Japanese market is that the TurboGrafx 16 was actually the second place finisher in the 16-bit wars. So obviously we can't trust the Japanese market. Let's just look at what happened in America. So in the US, Sega, after having a really pitiful launch in Japan, decided that they might as well minimize their risk and try to launch through Atari, because Atari had such a great name recognition here in the States. However, Atari was working on something else, and then Sega eventually decided to take a big risk and launch here in their own name. And it ended up being a risk that really paid off, and I bet that Atari is still kicking itself for not taking this offer. So in America, the Genesis launched in 1989, and then the SNES was released in 1991. And I guess 1991 is really the year that matters the most as a start date for the console war, even though I guess technically 1989 would be the official beginning. But during the years when both consoles were out, at first, from 1991 to 1994, the Genesis outsold the SNES. So this was when they were going head-to-head, and the Genesis was actually winning. And of all those years, the year that I identify as the peak of the 16-bit war was 1994. During this year, all kinds of iconic titles on both systems were released. Final Fantasy VI, Phantasy Star 4, the original Donkey Kong Country, a lot of those Konami ports, the Genesis I was talking about. Like 1994 was the 16-bit year. And it's also before all of the next generation consoles began to be released. But then from 1995 to 1997, the SNES outsold Genesis. In the Nintendo narrative, that's due to Donkey Kong Country, but in reality, it's due to a lot of other things. The shift that year, or over the course of 94 and 95, was not so much Donkey Kong Country as that Sega was shifting its focus to things like the Saturn, their next generation system, while Nintendo was delaying the N64 and they kept the SNES as their flagship console. Another factor to keep in mind is that because the SNES was released a little later and was a little more powerful, it still had a little bit more to give than the Genesis did, so it made sense that a lot of the best SNES games weren't released until 1995. Donkey Kong Country 2, Chrono Trigger, all kinds of things. Whereas Sega in 1995 got Vector Man, which is okay, but it's definitely not on the same level as something like a Chrono Trigger. So again, I don't really put much faith in this whole idea of the market decides what's better, but if we were going by that and we're looking at the American market, the Genesis not only won overall, but it won in the years that matter the most when both consoles were in their prime and both consoles were actually the flagship of their company. So now let's take a look at another key pillar of the Nintendo narrative. The idea that the SNES is the inherently superior piece of hardware across the board, with the exception of a slight difference in processor speed. The problem is that difference in processor speed is actually pretty significant. I don't remember the exact numbers, but Genesis had about twice the processing speed of the SNES. And what that translated to was not just fast games like Sonic 2, but also faster games in general and smoother games that had a lot less lag. So for instance, sometimes if you played two versions of the same game, you would see that the Genesis version ran more smoothly, even if it was not as pretty. You also see that in beat-em-ups, you could display more sprites on the screen. So you could have more chaotic action like what you see in Streets of Rage, rather than the 3-at-a-time fights of the Final Fight series on SNES. And that's a fairly significant thing, and that enabled Genesis to do some things better than the SNES. If you look at beat-em-ups and run-and-guns, the Genesis is far and away better on both of those genres than the SNES, which is not to say that the SNES doesn't have some good games in those genres, just that the Genesis has better games there. And the thing is, too, these hardware advantages and disadvantages don't always translate neatly into having better versions of the same game. So when different games are released for both consoles, sometimes you would be surprised by the results. So, some games simply catered to the strengths of one console rather than the other. For instance, the Strike series, Desert Strike, Jungle Strike, Urban Strike, on both consoles, definitely worked better on Sega because it was a game that was designed for lots of stuff to be happening on screen and a great deal of chaos. And displaying a lot of stuff at the same time was a Sega strength, not a Nintendo strength. However, on the other hand, Liberty or Death and a lot of the other Koei games were a lot better on SNES because these had busy displays where that superior color palette could be useful. And also, for whatever reason, Koei was very inconsistent when it came to working with the Genesis sound card. In Genghis Khan 2, the soundtrack on Genesis is indistinguishable from the SNES. But in Liberty or Death and Gemfire, the Genesis game induces headaches and the SNES game sounds pretty good. So it just really depends on what game you're looking at. In other cases, there are differences between the two versions, but ultimately the preference is a personal one. What things do you value more? And a great example of that is the Mortal Kombat series. A lot of people prefer the original Mortal Kombat on Genesis because it has blood. A lot of people prefer the controller of the Genesis or the Super Nintendo when playing the game. If you look at MK2, the SNES probably actually looks better overall, but the Genesis version, the screen design and layout looks more like the arcade. It's a lot of it is just subjective. So those are things that the Nintendo narrative really just doesn't take into account enough. Increasingly, a lot of channels on YouTube that look at games comparatively are aware of this. Console Wars actually does an excellent job of realizing that these hardware disparities don't necessarily translate directly into game quality. Aside from the built-in capabilities of the hardware and the fact that some games catered more to one system than the other, there was also the X factor of developer competence when you were looking at which port of a game would be better, the Genesis or Super Nintendo version. And sometimes what you would find is that the opposite of what you would expect ended up being true, not because the Genesis was secretly more powerful graphically or the SNES was secretly faster, but simply because one of the teams doing the development was either really good or really crappy at what they did for a living. So, let's look at some individual games where the general dichotomy of SNES equals better graphics and sound or Genesis equals faster gameplay dichotomy really just breaks down. So one example is the Ninja Turtles game on the respective consoles. So Genesis got Hyperstone Heist, and this came a little after Turtles in Time. And Hyperstone Heist on Genesis actually has a better color palette and better sound than the SNES port of Turtles in Time. However, Turtles in Time is quite a bit faster. It plays more smoothly, and it's arguably the best beat-em-up of the entire generation, even though Genesis normally dominates that genre. There also are other times where developers are either incompetent or for whatever reason didn't finish the job they set out to do. One example is Earthworm Jim on SNES, which has one fewer level than the Genesis version, for no apparent reason. Or in Samurai Showdown on Genesis, the character Earthquake isn't in the game, and no one is exactly sure why. I assume it had to be incompetence, though, because there's no real other explanation. Another thing that people need to keep in mind when they make comparisons between versions of games is when was the game released. So, for instance, a lot of times games would come out first on Genesis because it was the earlier console, and then 2 years later there would be an SNES port. Well, guess what? Yeah, of course the SNES version is going to be better. It has 2 years more experience put into it, and it can learn from the mistakes of its predecessor. There were other cases, though, a lot of which Nintendo fanboys will try hard to deny, where Genesis was the beneficiary of the later release date. So, for instance, there are elements about Castlevania Bloodlines which were superior to elements of Super Castlevania 4. The game was more fluid, the levels were designed better. Well, obviously, Konami had learned from what they had done with Super Castlevania. They benefited from that, and then they made a better game on the Genesis. I believe Alien 3, or was it Contra 3, Alien Wars came out first on SNES, then Contra Hardcore came out on Genesis, and almost everybody agrees Contra Hardcore was better. And a lot of the reason for that is simply that they had already had the experience of Contra 3, and they were able to take that and build upon it and cater a game directly to the strengths of the Genesis, like speed. So, these things always have to be taken into consideration, and it's not necessarily a direct reflection of what each console was capable of. A lot of it is based on other factors. So that's a level of nuance that anyone who's actually going to try to have this conversation in a serious way needs to take into consideration. Another pillar of faith within the Nintendo narrative is that the SNES controller is clearly superior because the design has endured and achieved dominance, and it also was more precise. So first things first, yes, the SNES controller has been deeply influential in the gaming industry. PlayStation, Xbox, Wii U, Switch, and most PC controllers are ultimately modeled on the button layout pioneered by the SNES controller. So that is true. The problem is, despite the fact that this is a true fact, it's also an irrelevant fact, because we're talking about the 16-bit war. We're talking about the period between 1989 and 1997. And even at the end of that period, when PlayStation had already basically adopted the SNES design and run with it, it still wasn't obvious that Sega was done for, or that their design was not the design of the future. Also, at that time, we had that weird design the Nintendo had come up with for the N64. Maybe that was the future. Who could have known? My point is that if you go back in time and you were to play Shaq Fu, or Batman Forever, or T2 Judgment Day, it wouldn't matter whether you're playing on the Genesis or SNES controller. That wouldn't have much of a bearing on your experience at the time. Because if you're playing any of those three games, you were wasting your time and no doubt suffering horribly. So, what I really want to point out here, though, is that once again, this is a subjective value, the idea that the SNES controller is better. Both controllers have strengths. So, the 3-button, 6-button Genesis controllers are more flexible for the most part and better for quick responses, twitch play, that kind of thing. The SNES controller, which was more precise, I guess you could say, was better for platform jumping, and not much else. So, the thing too that a lot of people ignore, a lot of people who aren't familiar with the Genesis library, is that the Genesis D-pad, and also the Saturn D-pad, which was essentially the same, that this was something that really enabled games to do things that they couldn't do on the SNES. So, for instance, the game Subterranea relies on subdirections. The Genesis D-pad allows for 8 directions rather than 4. And Subterranea is one of the few games which really takes full advantage of that. And this game would simply be impossible on any other console, at least until the advent of really responsive analog sticks that we have now and that we've had in the last couple of generations. But at the time, this is something that could have only been done on a Genesis. Another thing is that you can call it precise if you want, but you could also call it stiff. We're talking about the SNES D-pad. Because I actually love the SNES controller, but I really don't like the D-pad on it. Everything else about it is great, though. I wish I could take a Genesis D-pad and put it onto an SNES controller. That would actually be a great controller, but I guess that'll never happen. Another thing with Legacy is I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the Saturn 6-button design, which is based directly on the Genesis 6-button design, is still in use among fighting game fans. Oh, and by the way, another sub-argument that a lot of Nintendo narrative people make is that you can't count the Genesis 6-button controller because a lot of people didn't own it. The fact is, most people did have the 6-button controller. So it does count. It was a thing that Sega released that most gamers bought into. One really important factor that people often overlook when they're comparing the Genesis and SNES is just how unreasonably expensive SNES games actually were. So at the time, the average cost of a new Genesis game was about $49 to $59, whereas the average SNES game ran between $59 and $89. So if you were conducting your own cost-benefit analysis, you had to ask yourself the basic question: is the SNES version of this game $10 to $30 better than the Genesis version? And if you were aware of the fact that price doesn't always equal quality, you knew that you were always taking a gamble. Also, the game magazines of note at the time, Game Players, Game Pro, and all the others, Next Generation, whatever it was at the time, sometimes they got it wrong, as you might have discovered if you went on the recommendations all the time. So Genesis was a smaller risk, and it also could give you more bang for your buck, since if you were a kid at the time like me, and you were trying to get as much as you could for your birthday or Christmas, you knew that you could get more if you asked for Genesis games as opposed to SNES games. And because of the relative price of each one, and also that Genesis games went on sale a lot more often, as a kid I think I had 25 to 30 Genesis games and only about 7 or 8 SNES games. So, I definitely, that's part of the reason why I'm more of a Sega fan now. I simply had more access to Sega because it was more accessible. And along with this difference in both the cost of the system and the games, this helped to drive the creation of a class divide between Sega and Nintendo owners. I noticed growing up that when I'd meet other military kids, usually the children of officers would have the SNES, and the children of enlisted people who made less money would have the Sega. I also noticed later on when I was in high school and things like that, that usually kids who were minorities had been Genesis kids, and kids who were white were more likely to be Nintendo kids. So there's definitely a wealth divide between the two fan bases. And the wealthier that you grow up, the more likely you are to go on to college and all of that, especially now that we live in an era with very little social mobility. So the wealthy kids who own Nintendos all grew up to go to college, and then they posted on the internet. And I think that's really what creates, sustains, and drives the Nintendo narrative to a large extent, is simply that the kids who grew up to be the people who are the loudest and most confident in their opinions are mostly Nintendo fans. I mean, I've never really seen a really in-depth defense of Sega on the internet, but I've seen all kinds of mental gymnastics pulled on behalf of Nintendo. And that's not a coincidence. It's very much that class divide in action 20 to 30 years later. If I had to try to boil down the message of this entire video to one thing, that one thing would be to avoid the intellectual error of presentism. If we're trying to examine an event in the past, we need to try our best to view it from the lens of the people who were living at the time. So, if we really want to evaluate the 16-bit wars fairly as possible, we need to view it in the context of what happened in 1989 to 1997, not the context of 2018. And that's why, once again, I'd like to remind you of cost. Because today, if you're a retro gamer, you're either hardcore enough to shell out any amount of money, or you can get your stuff for free. So cost is no object. But if you're talking about the 90s during the 16-bit wars, cost was a very big factor unless you happen to be rich. Another thing is that another pillar of the SNES supremacy argument is that it was the greatest system ever for JRPGs, which is probably true, although I think you could also make an equally strong case for the PS1. But the problem is At the time, there were other genres that were just as popular, if not more so, and games that were just as well acclaimed as the still famous JRPGs. Arcade style beat 'em ups, run and guns, platformers, all those things were still really popular and were moving a lot of software. So those happened to be things that the Genesis did well in, and I think that's really why the Genesis outsold the SNES in the US, is because in genres that were very prevalent at the time, Genesis had a very strong showing, so even if it got blown out in JRPGs, it still delivered on the things that people cared about, or the things people cared the most about. Another problem with evaluating the 16-bit wars from the context of 2018 is that Genesis games a lot of times are rarely re-released or publicized. So a lot of the best Sega games were third-party games. Unlike Nintendo, Sega had quite a few third-party games that were really among the elite titles on the system. I guess, to be fair, SNES did too, but most Nintendo consoles since have been first-party heavy. At any rate, though, because of licensing problems with third-party games, Sega can't re-release a lot of these games on their various collections that people are familiar with, or put them on the virtual consoles with the same degree of ease that Nintendo can with its classic games. So because of this, a lot of people forget just how good the Genesis actually was. So for instance, Phantasy Star 4 was a Genesis JRPG, which is every bit as good as Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. No other game from that genre on the Genesis would I put in that category, but there were also some, like Phantasy Star 3 for instance, that were certainly competent JRPGs. One area where the Genesis actually had an edge on the SNES was in the tactical RPG genre. So, for instance, Shining Force 1 and 2 are better than anything available in the SNES, with the possible exception of the original Front Mission, which I still need to play. And I would even say that the games play as well or better than Final Fantasy Tactics on the PlayStation 1. The Shining Force games, if you're into tactical RPGs at all, you really, really, really need to play them. They run extremely well. So anyway, my point is that a lot of people who talk about how the SNES simply had better games, a lot of times don't really know everything that was available on the Genesis. And most likely they won't look into it and find out either. So, again, you have to know your subject and also think about how people would look at something during the time when it really mattered. Let's slay another sacred cow of the Nintendo narrative. In the Nintendo narrative, the Sega CD was a colossal failure which damaged Sega's brand and by its very existence proved that the Genesis was inferior to the SNES. So, one major problem right off the bat is that Nintendo was also looking into having a CD-ROM add-on. TurboGrafx 16 had one as well, and this was a common idea at the time. And in fact, Nintendo not only thought about it, they actually ordered Sony to make a working prototype of the system. Eventually, Nintendo backed out, and Sony really felt cheated by Nintendo, so they began making third-party games for the Sega CD, and then later used all of their experience to create the PlayStation. Anyway, so if this was something that really proved the inferiority of the Genesis, it was still something that the SNES was considering. So, maybe it's a bit hypocritical to say that having an add-on proves the inferiority of a system. Not a very good argument. The other thing is that the Sega CD was actually pretty innovative and had some quality titles on it. Now, the thing that Sega CD gets remembered for, unfortunately, are the full-motion video games. The things like Night Trap and Sewer Shark, and those other games that have not aged well and kind of even sucked from a gameplay perspective at the time. The problem with that is, though, again, we need to remember what era we're talking about. We're talking about the 90s. At the time, it wasn't clear that 3D polygons were the future. There was a case to be made that the future might lie in full motion video. and Sega was getting ahead of the curve. Now, granted, the 3DO did FMV games a lot better, but the 3DO was hyper expensive, and even getting a Genesis plus the Sega CD was still cheaper than the 3DO, not to mention that you had a much larger gaming library. At any rate, the other problem that a lot of people point out with the Sega CD, the unforgivable sin, was load time. I know some people say that the Sega CD port of Mortal Kombat shouldn't really count as a legitimate contender for best home port because it has load times between fights. The thing is, we're talking about the early 90s. Load times were not a cardinal sin at the time. It was something that was forgivable, and you also got a lot of quality out of it. The Sega CD ports of things like Final Fight and Mortal Kombat, those were the best home ports available until we got more modern consoles. They definitely blew away any of the competition. The other thing is that because of the capacity of a CD-ROM, if you put a traditional Genesis or SNES style game on the Sega CD, what you would get is a vastly superior version. A lot of people talk about how great the sound on SNES is, and it is great, but it's not CD quality. Compare Batman Returns on Sega CD versus SNES, or Eternal Champions on Sega CD as opposed to Genesis, or Final Fight on Sega CD as opposed to SNES. It's not a contest. Or even Earthworm Jim, Echo the Dolphin. A lot of games that appeared on these other two consoles, or at least one of them, appeared on the Sega CD, and in pretty much every case, the Sega CD game was superior. What really caused the Sega CD to not take off was more of a problem with Sega's strategy and the fact that they allowed FMV games to be one of their major focuses as opposed to just regular 16-bit style games that were enhanced experiences. Had they focused on the enhanced experiences of things that people actually liked, the Sega CD would have done better. But again, we'll get into Sega's vast incompetence at a later time. And now the time has arrived to talk about Sega's incompetence when we talk about the other great add-on for the Sega Genesis, the Sega 32X. Now, in the Nintendo narrative, the 32X was a failure, it damaged Sega's brand, and it should have never been released. I would say that on this one thing, the Nintendo narrative goes 3 for 3. The quibble that I have with this, however, is that a lot of Nintendo fans try to apply this to the 16-bit wars, and it has a little bit of bearing, but the main significance of the 32X in terms of the havoc that it unleashed on Sega's other consoles happened to the Sega Saturn, and I would also argue the Sega CD, which again is a bit of a side pod issue. So, the thing is, the Sega CD still had some life in it. Its CD-ROM format meant that you could still do things with it that you couldn't ever do with the 32X by itself. And by releasing the 32X and focusing on it, they took away attention from something which actually had some potential as a holdover until people were ready to upgrade to the Saturn. The other thing is, it did damage the brand of Sega, and the main system that people were unwilling to then support because of what happened with 32X was the Saturn. People who had a bad experience with 32X didn't suddenly toss their Genesis system in the trash, however. So the main impact has been a bit misjudged. The thing is, too, with 32X, it was a serviceable, if not very impressive, piece of hardware if it had been released at a lower price point and received more support. And the failure of the 32X, assuming that it had to be released, was still mostly due to yet more corporate incompetence on Sega's behalf. We'll talk about the details of that in a minute. If Sega had given the 32X a certain amount of time to be their sort of stopgap measure between Genesis and Saturn, then maybe it wouldn't have been the disaster that it was, and people could have forgiven them for it. But as it was, they ended up looking kind of greedy and dumb, since they released this as a 32-bit system and then released the Saturn within 6 months. The whole thing, though, is that Nintendo points this out and they talk about how stupid Sega is, and they have a point, but they forget something really important. Nintendo released a console at this time which was even crappier than the 32X. It was called the Virtual Boy. And yeah, we remember it, and it sucked. One thing that I regard as an undeniable fact on the side of the SNES is that if you look at the years from 1995 to 1997, the SNES simply had better releases at that time than the Genesis did. The Genesis very clearly peaked in 1994. A lot of Nintendo fans will say that it was the release of Donkey Kong Country which put the nail in Genesis's coffin, but really it was simply that Sega shifted their developmental focus to other platforms. Remember the 32X? Well, I wish I didn't, but I do. And I wonder how much the age of gamers at the time helped to influence their perception of the whole console war. So I know that I was 9 in 1995, but I'd started playing and owning a system when I was about 6 or 7, so I had a little bit of experience and I knew that there were some good games that had come out on Genesis. But if I had just started playing at the time, or had I been a few years younger, I might have looked around at the current crop of games and quickly formed the impression that the SNES was obviously superior. So a lot of it is a matter of perception, and a lot of our perceptions as gamers, especially when we're young and impressionable, has to deal with what time we emerged into some sort of gaming maturity. The other thing about the SNES really outperforming the Genesis, other than the focus of Sega being taken away from the Genesis, is that the SNES was newer and had a little more horsepower, so it kind of makes sense that its last-ditch efforts would be a little bit better than the Genesis. And if we look at 1995, the year where Sega's transition was going towards Saturn, the SNES pretty much peaked in 1995. You have Chrono Trigger, DKC2, Killer Instinct, and in 1996 you had Donkey Kong Country 3 and a couple of other big games. But I would also argue that one of the things that made SNES really stand out in 1995 was not so much that Genesis wasn't really doing much impressive outside of Vector Man, but that the launches of the PlayStation and Saturn were pretty underwhelming. If you look at the launch titles that Sony and Sega had for their new systems, they weren't very impressive. With the exception of Panzer Dragoon, most of them kind of sucked. Do you remember the original Tekken? The home port was garbage. Battle Arena Toshinden was garbage. Virtua Fighter on Saturn, the initial release, pretty much garbage. And those were supposed to carry the consoles, and they just really didn't have much to them. Not to mention that the consoles were expensive. And yeah. So because of that, there were plenty of gamers who were willing to hold out and keep playing SNES games. And that meant that these games, which might have been buried by the attention gained by exciting games, were instead in the limelight. So this really helped the perception of Nintendo, and also helped to even up the sales figures, which up to that point had heavily favored Sega in the United States. But then, of course, 1996 rolls around, and that's when the PlayStation really got going, and the Genesis got started down the path, the Saturn, got started down the path of irrelevancy. And at that point, we see that the SNES releases began to taper off, but there were still some hits that year, like DKC3. At any rate, though, the years that Nintendo won in the 16-bit war were 1995 to 1997, and while they do count, since the Genesis was still around and it was still officially supported, I really don't see it as all that significant when compared to the years 1991 to 1994, when both consoles were alive and kicking and releasing good games. That was really the time when the war was a war. I also wouldn't count the years 1989 to 1991 since only one of the two systems was around. Who cares if the Genesis outsold the SNES when the SNES didn't exist? Doesn't matter. Right? So anyway, that's why I think if you were really trying to get a feel for which system was better, you need to look at both these things at their prime, more than looking at both of them when they're at the end of their life cycle and one was a little bit newer. It'd be like comparing If you're comparing Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, and you compare them when Jordan was on the Wizards and he was nearly 40, and then Kobe was not even quite in his prime and he was an athletic monster. Well, who do you think is going to be better at that time? Right? Although that's not a good comparison, but you get what I mean. One piece of the Nintendo narrative that is rarely put into explicitude but is always present just beneath the surface is the idea that because the SNES was inherently superior, that Nintendo was destined to win, and that whatever successes the Genesis had were fleeting and destined to fade, because Genesis just didn't have that lasting quality that SNES had. Well, the thing is, like I said, I think that most of the Genesis's lack of influence today is due to the fact that Sega itself is not around to promote it. Nintendo still promotes its old IPs. It re-released the mini consoles. It has a lot of reach. It also has full access to the old libraries of its games that it can put out on the virtual consoles. Sega does not enjoy that luxury because they're barely even a thing anymore. And this whole inevitability idea is pretty dumb. Not only because inevitability narratives inevitably make you look like a moron who has to spend 2 years explaining why you lost to a game show host, but also this view is very much retconned in based on what happened in the 32-bit and whatever generation the PlayStation 2 was in, console wars. So Sega launched the Saturn and the Dreamcast, and both of them were financial failures of the first order. And therefore, a lot of Nintendo people say that those consoles sucked, that they had no good games on them, and, that obviously Genesis was the same. Well, the thing is, Genesis was way more successful than either of those, and Genesis actually, in its success, put Sega in a great position going forward that they squandered with 32X. And also, if you think that there aren't any good games on Saturn or Dreamcast, you aren't looking hard enough. There are good games. Most of them were only released in Japan if we're talking about the Saturn, and with the Dreamcast, no one was willing to really give Sega a chance as a hardware company at that point. So anyway, the thing is too, in 1995, Sega of America had done the impossible by defeating the Nintendo in the US market. So everyone thought they were geniuses. No one knew that they were incompetent enough to launch the 32X and then not support it. So let's get into what really killed Sega, because I think that really looking at the causes of what killed Sega should really help to put it in a context that should help to further discredit the Nintendo narrative. The thing that killed all of Sega's consoles was the incompetence of the Sega Corporation. So, like all Japanese-based companies, Sega of Japan wanted its office to make most of the major decisions and to exercise the majority of the power. But the power dynamic within the company got messed up when Sega of Japan really failed to sell systems and games, whereas Sega of America was bringing in all the money for the company and wanted to have a share in the power. So this created a rivalry and a power struggle. And the two branches of Sega would spend as much time and energy fighting each other as they did fighting Nintendo. The fact that Sega didn't fall apart sooner is in some ways kind of impressive. And basically, Sega of Japan was jealous, and they also became even more jealous when Sonic 2 was developed in the United States. So then Sega of Japan took over development for Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. And, the rivalry was childish and stupid. And, yeah, it's a microcosm of a larger problem. A problem of basic management. Anyway, despite the fact that the US market was larger and that's where Sega was making most of its dough, Sega of Japan sometimes withheld games from the US market for no reason. If you wanted to release these games somewhere where they would sell, you should probably release them in the US. If anything, there should have been games released in the US, not released in Japan, because that's where the Genesis fan base was. But Sega of Japan put its pride a lot of times above its thought process, above its logic. And the thing is, these two companies operated so independently that while Sega of Japan was busy at work on the Saturn, Sega of America was developing the 32X, and apparently neither branch of the company bothered to inform the other one of what they were doing and when they were looking at launching the console. So Sega of America presented the 32X as a done product to Sega of Japan, and Sega of Japan allowed it to be released and then threw the Saturn on top of it. Amazingly incompetent. It doesn't even make sense. So if you're wondering why Sega died and started to decline from 1995 on, it's because of Sega. Donkey Kong Country was a great game, but a great game on one system cannot kill another whole system or series of systems. Another thing is the developmental decisions that Sega made for the Saturn. So the Saturn was a big hit in Japan, but not in the US. And Sega helped to perpetuate that by not releasing a lot of the big hits in the US. So a lot of the best games on the system were simply not made available. And Nights in the Dreams was a great platforming game for the Saturn, but it didn't have the same draw as a 3D Sonic would have had. So Nintendo released a 3D Mario, and then Sega held off on releasing a 3D Sonic. Had they actually stuck with something that people wanted, who knows what would have happened. Also, Sega was still obsessed with the arcade idea. Everyone else knew that arcades were in decline by the mid-90s, but Sega thought that because of their strength in the arcades, that people would flock to the Saturn to get all the latest ports of Sega arcade games. And they were wrong. They were extremely wrong. So, yeah. Sega killed Sega. I think that is pretty much clear. I don't know who still believes this whole idea that Donkey Kong Country killed Sega. The real winner of the 16-bit console war were gamers like you and me. And this is for a variety of reasons. First of all, each system produced great games that are must-plays. And you really can't experience the 16-bit era in any meaningful way without playing both systems. Also, this era produced the most entertaining video game ads, and I think that some of the best ads were actually those 3DO ads really trying to throw shade at Genesis and Nintendo as being toys. Those ads are pretty funny. And ultimately, though, even if you see the SNES as the winner, Sega still did win at least one major victory in this war, and that was to show that Nintendo was not invincible. And that strong challenge that Sega made helped to contribute to the entry of Sony and Microsoft into the console market. And of course, the current state of gaming is unimaginable without PlayStation and Xbox. Also, I would like to point out that if Nintendo's current offerings are any real indication, it seems very unlikely that gaming would be what it is today if Nintendo were the central driving force on the home console market. Nintendo seems to be very risk and innovation averse at this point. You look at all the consoles they released, the last 3 consoles in a row, the Wii, Wii U, and Switch. All of them have been technically unimpressive, and all of them have relied extremely heavily on a core of franchises that Nintendo produces itself. And basically what we get are very minor upgrades in hardware specs and then very minor cosmetic upgrades to existing games. There's no meaningful innovation on Nintendo's part anymore. So perhaps it's possible that if Nintendo had completely wiped the floor with Sega, deterred Sony and Microsoft from entering the fray, that this would be the kind of garbage that we'd be stuck playing, or we'd be forced to play on the PC. But as it is, we have the option of playing on Xbox and PS4, and we can thank Sega for that.